Are you okay?
My baby.
Help! Somebody help her!
Amara fell to her knees at the hospital entrance, her hands wrapped around her swollen belly, her breath coming out in short, broken gasps. Daniel caught her before her head hit the ground. His voice cracked as he shouted for help, begging anyone in a white coat to come closer. Nurses walked past. A security guard glanced at them and looked away. Nobody moved fast. Nobody moved at all. Daniel knelt on the cold floor, holding his wife, whispering to her that she was going to be fine, that help was coming, that she just needed to breathe. But help was not coming. Not yet. The front desk clerk looked at Daniel's plain jacket, at his worn-out shoes, at Amara's simple dress, and made a decision in her mind before either of them said a single word. She assumed they had no money. She assumed they were nobody. What nobody inside that hospital knew was that the man begging for help owned everything they worked for. Nobody could have guessed it. Daniel Kim did not look like a billionaire. He did not dress like one, he did not speak like one, and he never wanted anyone to know he was one. He had built his fortune quietly, through shipping, technology, and hospitals across 3 continents, but he had learned a long time ago that money changes how people treat you, and not always for the better. So he hid it. He wore plain clothes. He drove an ordinary car when he could. He wanted to be loved for who he was, not for what he owned. That was how he met Amara 3 years earlier in a small town in Nigeria, far away from the glass towers of Seoul. She did not know who he was either, not at first. She only knew a quiet man who listened more than he spoke, who helped an old woman carry her groceries without being asked, who cried at a funeral for a stranger's child because his heart could not bear to see suffering and do nothing. She fell in love with his character, not his wallet. And Daniel, for the first time in his life, felt seen for exactly who he was. Before Amara, Daniel had learned a painful lesson about what money does to people. A sad young man, he once revealed his identity to a woman he trusted, only to watch her love change overnight, her warmth replaced by calculation, her questions suddenly about properties and inheritance instead of dreams and feelings. He had walked away from that relationship heartbroken, carrying a quiet vow with him ever since. He would never again let his wealth decide who loved him and who did not. So when he met Amara, he kept his secret close, testing her heart the only way he knew how, by giving her nothing but himself. They married quietly. No press. No cameras. Just 2 families and a small church filled with warm voices. Daniel promised her that whatever came, he would protect her from a world that judged people by their appearance instead of their hearts. He never imagined that promise would be tested inside a hospital lobby, on a night when everything seemed to be falling apart at once. Amara was 7 months pregnant. They had come to Korea to be closer to Daniel's ailing mother, and Amara had been feeling unusual pain all week, pain she brushed off as normal pregnancy discomfort. But that night, the pain became sharp, sudden, and terrifying. Daniel rushed her to the nearest hospital, one that, unknown to almost any owning the building, belonged to a parent company he quietly controlled, but nobody recognized him. Nobody looked past his tired eyes and his plain-clothes to see the man who signed off on their hospital's budget every year. All they saw was a foreign woman in pain, and a man who did not look rich enough to matter. The clerk finally spoke, her voice flat and unmoving. She said the emergency room required a deposit before treatment could begin, standard hospital policy, she said, especially for foreign patients without local insurance. Daniel's heart pounded. He told her his wife was in danger, that the baby could be in danger, that they needed to act now and worry about payment later. The clerk shook her head. Policy was policy, she said. Rules did not bend for people who looked like they could not pay. Daniel felt something he rarely felt, anger rising in his chest, hot and fast. But he did not raise his voice. He had learned long ago that anger clouds judgment, and Amara needed him thinking clearly, not shouting uselessly at people too small-minded to understand what they were dealing with. He swallowed his fury and turned back to his wife, whose face had gone pale, whose lips had begun to tremble from pain she could no longer hide. He offered his credit card, hoping that would end the argument quickly. The clerk swiped it, frowned, and said the system needed extra verification for large foreign transactions. Process that could take up to 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. 30 minutes felt like an eternity when his wife was gasping for breath on the floor beside him. He asked her, as calmly as he could manage, to call a doctor first and sort out payment after. She apologized with a voice that did not sound sorry at all, and repeated that rules were rules. A young nurse named Sujin noticed them from across the hallway. She had just finished at a double shift, exhausted, her feet aching inside her worn sneakers, but something about the fear on Daniel's face stopped her cold. She had seen many families in that lobby, but rarely had she seen a man look so desperately helpless while trying so hard to stay calm. She walked over without asking permission from anyone. She knelt beside Amara and checked her pulse, her breathing, the tightness of her belly. Her eyes widened. This was not ordinary discomfort. This looked like something dangerous, something that could not wait for paperwork or deposits or policy discussions. She turned to call for a doctor, but the head administrator, a sharp-eyed man named Mr. Choi, stepped out of his office at exactly the wrong moment. Mr. Choi did not like unauthorized care. He did not like nurses making decisions that were not theirs to make. He pulled Sujin aside and reminded her, in a low, hard voice, that hospital protocol existed for a reason, and that treating unpaying patients without proper approval could cost the hospital money it could not recover. Sujin argued that the woman's condition looked urgent, that minutes mattered, that this was not about protocol but about a human life. Mr. Choi was unmoved. He told her to wait for the deposit confirmation like everyone else. Daniel overheard every word. Something inside him went cold, not with rage, but with acquiescent, dangerous clarity. He understood now that this was not simple bureaucracy. This was a broken system, run by people who valued money over the very lives they were supposed to save. And in that moment, standing on the floor of a hospital he secretly owned, holding his suffering wife in his arms, Daniel made a decision that would change everything for everyone in that building. He gently laid Amara's head against his jacket, kissed her forehead, and told her to hold in just a little longer. Then he stood, walked a few steps away, and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number that very few people in the world had ever seen him call. It rang en liance. "This is Daniel," he said quietly. "I need the board assembled. I need Dr. Han Moveto Sol General immediately, and I need everyone to know exactly who owns this hospital, within the next 10 minutes. Subscribe because this story is getting intense from here." The call lasted less than a minute, but the weight in Daniel's voice told Sujin that something enormous had just been set into motion. She did not know who he had called. She did not know why a man in a plain jacket suddenly carried himself like a king giving orders. All she knew was that the fear in his eyes had transformed into something else entirely, something steady, something unshakable. Meanwhile, Amara's condition worsened. Her breathing grew shallow. A sharp cry escaped her lips as another wave of pain crashed through her body. Sujin, ignoring Mr. Choi's warning completely now, shouted down the hallway for a doctor, any doctor immediately. A young resident finally rushed over, checked Amara's vitals and paled. He turned to Mr. Choi and said the words no administrator wants to hear in a hospital lobby full of witnesses. "Sir, if we do not act now, we could lose both the mother and the child." Mr. Choi hesitated, torn between protocol and panic, but before he could respond, the hospital's front doors burst open. A convoy of black luxury cars pulled up outside, tires screeching against the pavement. Men in dark suits stepped out in perfect formation, moving with the kind of urgency reserved for heads of state. Security guards, who moments earlier had ignored Daniel completely, now stood frozen, unsure whether to stop the newcomers or step aside. A tall woman in an elegant coat walked in first, flanked by two executives whose faces the hospital staff recognized instantly from company newsletters and annual meetings. Whispers rippled through the lobby. Nobody understood why the parent company's top executives had just arrived in the middle of the night, moving with such urgency, their eyes fixed directly on the quiet man in the plain jacket still standing beside his suffering wife. Mr. Choi's confident expression began to crack. The woman in the coat walked straight past the front desk, ignoring the clerk completely, and stopped in front of Daniel. She bowed low, deeply, the way subordinates bow to Somyeon, whose word could end careers with a single sentence. "Chairman Kim," she said, loud enough for half the lobby to hear. "Everything is being arranged. Dr. Han is already on his way." Clerk's face went white. The word chairman echoed through the hallway like agonshot. Mr. Choi's legs seemed to weaken beneath him. Sujin's mouth fell open. Every person who had ignored Daniel, judged him, dismissed him, now understood in one terrifying moment exactly whose hospital they had been standing in all along. But there was no time to explain, no time for apologies, no time for anything except one final desperate question that hung in the air as Amara's cry grew weaker and the machines beside her began to beep in a rhythm nobody wanted to hear. Would they reach her in time? The machines beeped faster. Amara's eyes fluttered, half open, half lost in pain, and Daniel dropped to his knees beside her again, gripping her hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. He whispered her name over and over, begging her to stay with him, to keep breathing, to hold on just a few seconds longer. Around them, the lobby had gone completely silent, every staff member frozen, watching a scene none of them understood but all of them now feared. Then the elevator doors at the far end of the hallway opened, and a tall man in a long gray coat stepped out, moving faster than anyone had ever seen a doctor move in that building. This was Dr. Han, the country's leading specialist in high-risk pregnancies, a man who normally only treated presidents, celebrities, and foreign dignitaries. He had been pulled from his home in the middle of the night, and he had not asked a single question before coming. When Chairman Kim called personally, nobody asked questions. They simply came. Dr. Han knelt beside Amara without wasting a second, his hands moving with practiced calm over her belly, her pulse, her breathing. His face tightened. He barked orders in sharp, clear Korean, and within moments a stretcher appeared, along with a full team of nurses who, only minutes earlier, had been standing idle behind the front desk pretending not to notice a dying woman on their floor. Sujin ran alongside the stretcher as they rushed Amara toward the operating wing, refusing to let go of her hand even for a second. She had been the only one who tried toe help when it mattered, and now she was determined to stay by Amara's side until the very end, whatever that end would be. Daniel moved to follow, but a firm hand caught his shoulder. It was the woman in the elegant coat, the executive who had bowed to him earlier. She said gently that Dr. Han needed space to work, that the next few minutes were critical, and that passing outside the operating room would not help Amara. Daniel understood the truth in her words, but understanding did not make the waiting any easier. He stood frozen in the hallway, staring at double doors that had just swallowed the only woman he had ever truly loved. Behind him, the hospital lobby had transformed into something unrecognizable. Word had spread through every department in seconds. Chairman Kim was here. Chairman Kim, the reclusive owner whose face almost nobody in the building had ever actually seen, the man whose signature approved every budget, every renovation, every staff bonus, had been standing in their lobby all along, dressed like an ordinary visitor, begging for help that nobody gave him. Mr. Choi stood near the front desk, his face the color of old paper, his mind racing through every decision he had made in the last 20 minutes, searching desperately for a way to explain himself. He tried to approach Daniel, forcing a smile onto his trembling face, ready to offer apologies wrapped in polite corporate language. Daniel turned to look at him, and something in that quiet, steady gaze made Mr. Choi stop walking entirely. There was no anger in Daniel's eyes. There was something far more unsettling than anger. There was disappointment. "You knew a woman was dying," Daniel said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "and you asked her husband for a deposit." Mr. Choi opened his mouth, but no words came out. Every excuse he had prepared crumbled the moment he tried to speak it aloud. He looked around at the staff watching him, the same staff who had followed his orders without question only minutes earlier, and he realized, for the first time, exactly how small his own excuses sounded now that the truth stood in front of everyone. For years, Mr. Choi had run this branch like his own small kingdom, proud of his cost-cutting numbers, proud of the bonuses those numbers earned him from a board that rarely asked how the savings were achieved. He had told himself that turning away a few and paying patients here and there was simply good business, the price of keeping a hospital running efficiently. He had never once imagined that the very man signing his bonus checks would one day stand in his lobby, disguised as an ordinary patient's husband, watching him deny care to a dying woman. Now, under Daniel's quiet gaze, every justification he had built over the years collapsed into dust. The clerk who had first turned Amara away stood frozen behind the front desk, her hands shaking as she scrolled back through her own memory of the last half hour, replaying every cold word she had spoken to a man who could end her career with a single sentence. She had judged Amara's dark skin, Daniel's plain jacket, their quiet foreign accents, and decided within seconds that they were not worth the hospital's time. Nosh understood that the very people she dismissed held more power over her future than anyone else in the building. Daniel did not look at her. He did not look at any of them. His entire focus remained locked on the operating room doors, his heart pounding with every second of silence that passed. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Nurses moved briskly past him carrying supplies. Machines could be heard beeping steadily somewhere beyond Thedor's, a rhythm that gave him a small, fragile thread of hope. While Daniel waited, one of the executives quietly pulled up the hospital's patient records in a tablet, searching for something that made her frown deeper with every screen she scrolled through. This was not the first time a patient had been turned away over a deposit. There were other names, other dates, other families who had been sent home delayed, or refused simply because a clerk decided, in a few careless seconds, that they did not look like they could pay. Most of those families had no idea who truly owned the hospital. Most of them had simply gone elsewhere, or worse, had not made it at all. The executive's hands trembled slightly as she showed the tablet to a colleague. This was bigger than one bad night. This was a pattern, hidden for years under the comfortable cover of policy and procedure. Daniel had built his hospitals with one simple rule in mind, a rule inspired by his own mother, who had once been turned away from a small clinic decades ago for arriving without cash in hand, an experience that nearly cost her life and left a permanent scar on Daniel's heart. He had promised himself, long before he ever met Amara, that no hospital under his name would ever treat a human life as a business transaction. Yet somehow, quietly, that promise had been buried under paperwork, quotas, and administrators more interested in numbers than people. Standing in that hallway, waiting to learn if his wife and child were alive, Daniel understood that his own carelessness in staying hidden for so long had allowed this rot to spread unchecked. Sujin's kindness that night had not been an accident either. She had grown up watching her own grandmother struggle to get proper care in a rural clinic, waiting hours while wealthier patients were seen first. She had become a nurse specifically so that no one would ever feel invisible in a hospital the way her grandmother once had. When she saw Amara collapse, she had not seen a foreigner or a woman without money. She had simply seen someone who needed help, and that was always enough for her. Then, without warning, one of the monitors let out a long, flat, continuous tone. Daniel's blood went cold. He knew that sound. Everyone in a hospital knows that sound, whether they have medical training or not. It is the sound nobody ever wants to hear. He lunged toward the operating room doors, but the executive woman and two security guards caught him before he could push through. He fought against them, shouting Amara's name, his composed exterior finally cracking completely under the weight of pure terror. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, Daniel Kim, the calm and quiet billionaire who never raised his voice, screamed. Inside the operating room, Dr. Han's hands moved faster than they ever had in his career. Amara's blood pressure had dropped dangerously low, and the baby's heartbeat had grown weak and irregular. Sujin, still holding Amara's limp hand, watched the numbers on the monitor climb and fall with terrifying unpredictability. Dr. Han called foreign emergency delivery, his voice sharp with urgency that silenced the entire room. Seconds mattered now more than they ever had. One wrong move, one moment of hesitation, and Daniel could lose both his wife and his unborn child in the very hospital he owned, failed by the very system he had built to protect people just like her. A junior nurse dropped a tray of instruments in her panic, the metallic clatter echoing through the operating room like a small explosion. Dr. Hand did not even flinch. His focus stayed locked entirely on Amara, his hands moving with the precision of a man who had performed this exact emergency 100 times before, though never with this much pressure resting on his shoulders. He knew exactly who was waiting outside those doors. He knew that failure tonight would not simply mean losing a patient. It would mean facing a grief no apology could ever soften. Somewhere beyond the operating room, in a small waiting area down the hall, Amara's mother-in-law, Daniel's own ailing mother, had just been informed of what was happening. Too weak to walk there herself, she asked only one question through the phone, her voice trembling with an old woman's quiet fear. She asked whether her grandchild would live to see the morning. Nobody could answer her yet. Outside those doors, Daniel stood shaking, held back by hands he barely felt, his eyes locked on doors that refused to open, praying to a God he had not spoken to in years, bargaining with a universe that suddenly felt cruel and indifferent to everything he had built. And then the flat tone stopped. A new sound replaced it, faint at first, then unmistakable, a baby's cry. But before anyone could tell Daniel whether his wife had survived the delivery that nearly killed her, the operating room doors swung open, and Dr. Hand stepped out with an expression that Daniel could not read at all. For one unbearable second, nobody in that hallway breathed. Dr. Hand's tired eyes met Daniel's, and for one more unbearable second, his expression gave nothing away. Then slowly, a small, exhausted smile broke across his face. "They are both alive," he said. "Your wife is weak, but she is stable, and your daughter is breathing on her own." Daniel's knees gave out. The security guards who had been holding him back now caught him instead, easing him gently to the floor as relief crashed through his body like a wave had no strength left to fight. He pressed both hands over his face and wept, openly, without shame, in the middle of a hospital lobby full of staff who had spent the last hour judging him for looking like a man who had nothing. A moment later, they wheeled Amara out, pale and exhausted but alive, her eyes flittering open just enough to find Daniel's face above her. She managed a weak smile, and though she could barely speak, her lips formed his name. Beside her, a nurse carried a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft white blanket, a small, healthy cry rising from inside it, the most beautiful sound Daniel had ever heard in his life. He touched his daughter's tiny hand for the first time, and in that moment the fear, danger, the humiliation of the last hour all melted away, replaced by something simple and overwhelming. Gratitude. Not for his wealth, not for his power, simply for the fact that his family was alive. A few hours later, once Amara had been moved to a private recovery room, Daniel's mother arrived, moving slowly with the help of a cane, her frail body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and joy. She had spent the entire night praying in a small waiting room down the hall, refusing to leave despite her own failing health, refusing every offer to be taken home and told the news later. When she finally saw her granddaughter, wrapped snugly in a white blanket, tears filled her tired eyes. She reached out with a shaking hand and touched the baby's soft cheek, whispering something in Korean that Amara did not fully understand but somehow felt completely. It was a blessing, old and simple, the kind passed down through generations of mothers who had survived hardships of their own. Daniel watched his mother and his daughter together, 3 generations connected in one quiet hospital room, and he thought about how close the universe had come to erasing Alafit in a single careless hour. He made a silent promise to himself that night, one he intended to keep for the rest of his life. No one else would ever have to fight the way he and Amara had fought, just to be seen as human beings worthy of care. Sujin stood a few steps away, quietly wiping tears from her own eyes, careful not to intrude on the family's private moment. She had done nothing that night except follow the simple instinct that had guided her entire career, to see a person in pain and try to help them, regardless of who they were or what they had. She never imagined that instinct would place her at the center of the most important night of her professional life. Daniel noticed her standing there, and even in his exhaustion, he did not forget. He walked over, still unsteady on his feet, and took her hand in both of his. He thanked her, not with the practiced politeness of a businessman, but with the raw sincerity of a husband and new father who understood exactly how close he had come to loosen everything. Mr. Choi, on the other hand, had quietly slipped toward a side hallway, hopping to disappear before anyone could ask him difficult questions. He did not get far. Two of Daniel's executives intercepted him calmly, informing him that his employment, along with several of his decisions over the years, would need to be reviewed immediately by the board. Mr. Choi's face turned the color of ash. He tried to argue, tried to explain, tried to torment them of his years of loyal service and impressive cost reports, but nobody in Thathalway was interested in hearing it anymore. His quiet kingdom of policy and paperwork had finally collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty. The clerk who had first refused Amara care stood behind the front desk long after the crisis had ended, unsure whether she still had a job to return to the next morning. She did not run. She did not hide. She waited quietly for whatever consequence was coming, understanding that pretending the last hour had not happened would not undo the harm nearly caused by her own careless judgment. In the days that followed, Daniel did not seek loud revenge. He did not hold press conferences or publicly shame the hospital that had almost cost him his family. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He bought out the remaining shares of the Hospitalchen entirely, becoming its full and open owner for the first time in years. He personally reviewed every case the executive's tablet had uncovered that night, every patient turned away, every family delayed by careless policy. Some cases could still be made right. Families received compensation, apologies, and in several cases, ongoing care free of charge. Other cases, sadly, could not be undone, and Daniel made sure their stories were never forgotten, using them as painful reminders of exactly what happens when compassion is replaced by cold procedure. Mr. Choi was quietly removed from his position, along with two other administrators whose names appeared far too often in the record of turned-away patients. Daniel did not destroy them publicly. He simply made sure they would never again hold a position where a human life depended on their judgment. The clerk, surprisingly, was not fired. Daniel, remembering his own past mistakes and the grace others had once shown him, offered her a choice instead of a punishment. She would undergo training focused entirely on patient care and human dignity, and she would spend 3 months working directly alongside Soo-jin, learning what true compassion in medicine actually looked like. She accepted, humbled, grateful for a second chance Sheknu she did not necessarily deserve. Soo-jin, meanwhile, received something she never expected. Daniel personally funded her advanced nursing education, covering every cost so she could become the Vera specialist doctor she had dreamed of becoming since childhood, back when she used to imagine helping patients the way she wished someone had helped her grandmother. She was also promoted to head of a new department Daniel created specifically for her, one focused entirely on patient advocacy, ensuring no family would ever again be dismissed by a hospital under his name. When Soo-jin received the news, she cried harder than she had at any point during that long, frightening night. She called her grandmother immediately, her voice breaking as explained what had happened, how a single decision to kneel down and check on a stranger had changed the direction of her entire life. Her grandmother, now old and slow of speech, simply laughed softly and told her that kindness always finds its way back around, sooner or later, whether or not anyone is watching. But the most important change Daniel made was the simplest one. He gathered every single member of his hospital board, every administrator, every regional director, into owner room, and he laid down a single new rule that would apply across every hospital he owned, without exception. No patient in a medical emergency could ever be turned away, delayed, or denied treatment because of how they looked, what they wore, where they came from, or whether they could immediately prove they could pay. Payment could always be discussed later. A human life could never wait. He did not deliver this rule with anger. He delivered it with the same calm, quiet steadiness he had carried through the worst night of his life. He reminded the board of the woman who had once been turned away from a small clinic decades earlier, an old woman who nearly died waiting for cash she did not have. He reminded them that she was his mother. And he reminded them that on this particular night it had almost happened again, this time to his wife and his newborn daughter, inside a hospital that bore his own name. Weeks later, Amara sat by the window of their home, her daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, sunlight falling softly across both their faces. Daniel stood beside her, watching the two people who mattered more to him than every building, every company, and every dollar he had ever owned. He thought back to the night he had knelt on that cold hospital floor, powerless despite his fortune, invisible despite his name, and he understood something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Money could open doors. Money could move mountains, summon doctors, and command armies of executives in the middle of the night. But money alone could not create a compassion. Compassion had to be chosen, again and again, by ordinary people in ordinary moments, long before any billionaire ever walked through the door. Somewhere in that same hospital, months later, a new plaque was quietly placed near the emergency entrance, small, simple, and easy to miss unless you knew to look for it. It read only one sentence: "No one who needs help will ever be turned away here again." Nobody visiting that hospital ever knew the full story behind those words. They did not know about the quiet billionaire who once knelt on that very floor, begging for his wife's life. They did not know about the nurse whose kindness changed the course of an entire hospital system, or the corrupt administrator whose careless cruelty finally caught up with him, or the young clerk who learned, painfully, that dignity should never depend on appearances. But every single day, because of what happened on that one terrifying night, someone walked through those doors and received the care they needed, immediately, without question, without judgment, and without ever being asked to prove they were worthy of being saved. And that, in the end, was the only kind of legacy Daniel Kim had ever truly wanted to leave behind.